Fear stops you from acting, risks everything you want, and keeps you stuck. But what if you could turn it into your greatest weapon? Musashi never lost a duel, not once in over 60 battles. But his most remarkable legacy wasn't his undefeated record. It was his fearless philosophy, inspiring not just samurai but modern icons like Elon Musk and Kobe Bryant, both of whom turned fear into a driving force for greatness. In this video, I'll show you Musashi's strategy to master fear and use it to conquer your challenges. Miss this and fear keeps winning. Watch through and you'll never see it the same way again. Part 1. The Shadow of Fear. The early morning mist was thick, rolling across the dirt like a restless sea. The world around Musashi was muted, the edges of the clearing blurring into a canvas of pale gray. He stood motionless, his sword trembling in his hand as though it could sense the storm brewing within him. Across the clearing, his opponent stood tall, a figure of unshakable calm. His eyes were like steel, reflecting no doubt, no hesitation. Only the cold certainty of a man who had walked this path before and left others broken behind him. Musashi, on the other hand, felt like a child playing at being a warrior. His grip faltered, the hilt of his sword damp with sweat. His breath came in shallow gasps, each one catching in his throat. He tried to still his hands, but the trembling wouldn't stop. His legs felt rooted to the ground, not in strength, but in fear. Fear whispered to him, its voice soft yet cutting, insistent yet cruel. "You're not ready. This isn't your fight. You'll fail. You'll die." The duel hadn't even begun, but Musashi was already losing, not to his opponent, but to himself. The fear wasn't just in his shaking hands or his quickened breath. It was in the stories his mind was telling him. Stories of failure, inadequacy, humiliation. What if I'm not strong enough? What if this is my last morning alive? The fear twisted inside him, tightening its grip with every passing second, making his opponent seem larger, the clearing smaller, the moment unbearable. Fear is a strange and universal thing. It feeds on uncertainty, on the unknown. It magnifies weaknesses and amplifies doubts. And in that moment, it seemed to Musashi like an unstoppable force. But what he didn't yet understand was that fear itself wasn't the enemy. Fear wasn't trying to destroy him, it was testing him. In that misty clearing, Musashi stood at a crossroads. He could let fear dictate his actions, force him to flee or surrender. Or he could face it. He didn't know it yet, but this was the real duel. Not the one with the man across the field, but the one raging within him. Fear isn't the problem. It doesn't exist to stop you. It exists to challenge you. The question isn't whether fear will show up, it always will. The question is how you'll respond when it does. Will you run, or will you stand your ground and let the battle begin? Part 2. The Turning Point. The first light of dawn broke through the mist, casting long shadows across the clearing. Musashi stood in the same spot, sword in hand, but something within him had shifted. The weight in his chest, the suffocating grasp of fear, hadn't vanished. But it was no longer paralyzing. In that moment, as the sun climbed higher and the world began to stir, Musashi had a realization that would change the course of his life. His fear wasn't born solely from the man standing before him, nor even from the threat of death. The true source of his fear lay within himself, his attachment to the outcome. What if I lose? What if I'm humiliated? What if I don't survive? These thoughts weren't just fears, they were chains, binding him to a future he couldn't control and pulling him away from the present moment. Musashi closed his eyes and took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. He began to recall a lesson his father had once taught him, a philosophy he hadn't fully understood until now. Think lightly of yourself and deeply of the world. In that single line, he found clarity. If he could let go of his obsession with winning or surviving, if he could detach from the need for a specific outcome, fear would lose its power. He realized that his opponent wasn't the true threat. His own mind was. Fear only existed because he had given it something to hold on to. His ego, his pride, his need for control. But what if he let it go? What if, instead of fixating on what might happen, he focused solely on what was in front of him. The moment he released his grip on the future, his thoughts sharpened, and the world around him seemed to crystallize. His opponent's movements, the weight of the sword in his hand, the steady rhythm of his breathing, it all came into focus. This was Musashi's epiphany. Fear cannot thrive in the present moment. It feeds on what-ifs and worst-case scenarios. But when you let go of the need to control what's beyond your reach, you free yourself to act. He understood that the path to fearlessness wasn't about eliminating fear, but about severing its lifeline, attachment. Fear only controls you when you cling to the outcome. Detach from the need to win, to be perfect, or to avoid failure, and you'll find the freedom to act with clarity. As Musashi learned that day, true strength comes not from suppressing fear, but from accepting it and focusing on the task at hand. Part 3. The Genius Strategy. Fear may feel overwhelming, but Musashi discovered that it could be conquered through deliberate action. He didn't stumble upon this truth by accident. It came through intense observation of his own mind and relentless discipline. Over time, Musashi crafted a strategy that transformed fear from a crippling force into a tool he could master. Here's how he did it, step by step. Step 1. Embrace fear. Musashi didn't resist his fear, he let it in. Instead of wasting energy denying its presence, he acknowledged it. Fear wasn't something to fight, but something to understand. Standing in the dueling ground, he focused on what he could control: his grip on the sword, the rhythm of his breathing, the feel of the earth beneath his feet. He let the fear coexist with his actions, allowing it to fuel his awareness instead of clouding his judgment. When fear grips you, don't push it away. Pause and name it. What exactly are you afraid of? Then redirect your focus to what you can control in the moment. Whether it's a steady breath, a clear thought, or a single action, anchoring yourself in the present reduces fear's power. Step 2. Detach from the outcome. Musashi knew that fear thrives on attachment to results. In his duels, the thought of victory or defeat was irrelevant. What mattered was the fight itself. By letting go of the need to win or avoid loss, he freed himself to focus fully on the process. This detachment sharpened his awareness and eliminated distractions. Stop fixating on whether you'll succeed or fail. Instead, immerse yourself in the process. Whether it's giving a presentation, learning a new skill, or facing a challenge, focus on the steps, not the result. Step 3. Use fear as a guide. Musashi began to see fear not as a weakness, but as a messenger. It pointed directly to what mattered most. Fear of failure, for example, revealed his desire to succeed. Fear of judgment highlighted his need for validation. By understanding what his fears were tied to, he could use them to clarify his priorities and take deliberate action. Ask yourself, what does this fear reveal about what I value or avoid? If you fear speaking up, it might mean you value respect or clarity. Use this insight to guide your next action. Step 4. Act decisively. For Musashi, the moment he moved, fear dissolved. Action silenced the chaotic thoughts in his mind. His opponent was no longer a towering threat, but a puzzle to solve. Every step, every swing of his blade became part of a calculated response to the present moment. Don't overthink. Act. Fear grows in the gaps between thought and action. Identify one step, no matter how small, and take it immediately. Once you start, fear begins to fade. Musashi's strategy wasn't about banishing fear, it was about mastering it. By embracing fear, detaching from outcomes, using it as a guide, and acting decisively, he transformed what once held him back into his greatest ally. The same is possible for you. Fear isn't your enemy. It's your invitation to grow. Part 4. The Triumph. Musashi's victory over fear. The duel was over in an instant. The crowd, small and silent, barely had time to comprehend what had happened. Musashi's opponent lay defeated, his sword lying in the dust. Musashi stood over him, his blade steady, his breath calm. But this victory wasn't about the duel. It wasn't about defeating the man before him. The true battle had been fought and won within Musashi himself. In that moment, Musashi became untouchable, not because he was fearless, but because he understood fear. Fear hadn't vanished. It was still there, lingering in the depths of his mind, but it no longer controlled him. He had faced it, acknowledged it, and let it guide him to focus on what truly mattered. The need to win, the terror of failure, the attachment to survival, all of it dissolved the moment he moved. He wasn't fighting for victory, he was simply acting in the present with absolute clarity. This triumph marked a turning point in Musashi's life. From that day forward, fear became his teacher, not his master. In every duel, every decision, every step he took, he carried with him the lesson that fear is not an obstacle but a force to be understood and harnessed. And the truth is, you don't have to be a samurai to apply this lesson. Fear is universal. It grips us in moments big and small. Whether it's speaking up, starting something new, or facing an unknown future, fear whispers the same lies it whispered to Musashi. You're not ready. You'll fail. You can't do this. But Musashi's journey shows us the way forward. The next time fear grips you, pause. Acknowledge it. Let go of the outcomes that weigh you down and focus on what you can do right now. Take one step, any step, and watch as fear begins to lose its hold. Fear doesn't have to paralyze you. Like Musashi, you can turn it into a source of clarity and strength. The battle isn't about eliminating fear, it's about understanding it and using it to move forward. The question isn't whether fear will show up. It will. The question is, will you let it control you, or will you act despite it? The choice, as Musashi learned, is yours.